The drums echoed across a bright morning in Ouagadougou. Hundreds of young faces still carrying the dust of their 10 days of training lifted their eyes toward their president. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the stage, not as a distant head of state, but as an older brother visibly moved by the sight of a new generation in formation. He spoke slowly with the weight of conviction. Vous êtes l'avenir de notre nation. Personne ne viendra d'ailleurs pour le bâtir. C'est à vous. You are the future of our nation. No one from outside will build it. It is your responsibility. This story begins with what looks like a summer camp. But it was no ordinary vacation. For 10 days, these young people were tested in ways that would have startled many in the West. They ate together on the ground, shoulder to shoulder, sharing not just food but struggle. They learned discipline that in society, you cannot simply do whatever you please. You must listen. You must compromise. You must carry the common burden. They learned humility, that solidarity and friendship are the true foundation of strength. And above all, they learned love of country, shouting in unison, La patrie ou la mort, the homeland or death. What happened here is more than a camp. It is the opening act of a national education program that President Traoré intends to spread across all of Burkina Faso. While the country is still at war, he is planting the seeds of hope by investing in the spirit of its youth. A bold decision, one that raises questions. Will this kind of civic military training truly prepare them to rebuild the nation? Or does it risk becoming another form of state control over the next generation? And so the question is passed to you when you look into the determined eyes of these children. Do you believe they are ready to carry the weight of Burkina Faso's tomorrow? If you feel this is a necessary step for Africa's future, please share this video. And if you believe the truth matters more than the headlines, make sure to subscribe and stay with us. The air at Mariangouabi was thick with both dust and anticipation. For 10 days, dozens of young boys and girls had traded the comfort of their homes for discipline, shared hardship, and a lesson that would follow them for the rest of their lives. What unfolded here was not just a camp in the traditional sense, it was a carefully designed experiment to shape the next generation of Burkina Faso. From the outside, the campgrounds looked modest, a clearing with rows of tents, simple benches, and open spaces for drills. But within those 10 days, an extraordinary transformation had taken place. These young campers were introduced to civic instruction, basic military discipline, cultural workshops, and manual labor. They paved a 300-square-meter courtyard with their own hands, planted fruit trees that would one day provide food and shade, and built benches for future generations to rest on. Every action had meaning. Every task was a symbol of what it means to take ownership of one's homeland. President Ibrahim Traoré himself came to speak at their closing ceremony, his words reinforcing the depth of what had been achieved. He congratulated them, reminding them that this was not just a holiday activity, but the very first cohort of a program that could one day be integrated into Burkina Faso's entire education system. These campers, he said, were pioneers carrying the responsibility to share what they learned with classmates and communities back home. The core lesson was clear: Burkina Faso is at war, but war is temporary. The rebuilding of a nation, however, is eternal, and that responsibility falls on its youth. No one from outside will build it for you, Traoré declared. His voice steady but charged with emotion carried across the camp. He reminded them that the future of their nation will not be handed down by foreign powers, but forged by their own hands and hearts. Each day of the camp had been structured around a dual purpose: to instill practical skills and to cultivate values. In the mornings, the youth engaged in civic and military-style training, learning discipline, teamwork, and respect for authority. They practiced drills not for war, but for unity. They learned that freedom is not the absence of rules, but the presence of responsibility toward others. In the afternoons, they participated in art and cultural activities, discovering that a strong nation must be rooted not only in defense, but in identity, heritage, and creativity. Perhaps the most powerful lessons came in the smallest acts. Sitting together on the ground to eat a simple meal taught them humility. Sharing their food with someone who had less taught them solidarity. Standing shoulder to shoulder during long hours of training taught them endurance. And each of these moments reminded them of what President Traoré repeated: weak men create times of war. Strong men build peace. The camp was designed to ensure that Burkina Faso's next generation would not grow weak in comfort, but strong in hardship and unity. Beyond the activities themselves, the camp was also carefully organized to build pride in the nation's diversity. Campers were divided into sections, each named after local traditions and cultural roots. Every section carried its own motto, blending respect for heritage with responsibility for the future. This structure reminded them that they were not just individuals, but part of a greater whole, a society where one person's actions ripple into the lives of others. As the camp drew to a close, the young participants did not leave empty-handed. They left behind a tangible legacy, a paved square fruit trees and benches that would remain long after their departure. These were more than physical contributions, they were monuments to a philosophy. They symbolized the idea that every citizen, no matter how young, has the power to leave behind something of value for the community. And so the event at Mariangouabi became a blueprint. It demonstrated how a simple 10-day camp could serve as a microcosm of a nation's rebuilding. In those 10 days, Burkina Faso's youth were taught that the future is not something to wait for, it is something to build. And that is precisely the message President Traoré wanted the world and his people to hear. The closing ceremony of the camp was not meant to be just a formality, it became the emotional high point of the entire 10-day journey. As President Ibrahim Traoré stood before the rows of young campers, the atmosphere shifted from discipline to deep emotion. The campers, still in their simple uniforms, their hands dusty from work, their voices hoarse from chanting, listened in silence as their leader delivered words that would etch themselves into memory. He began softly, almost as if speaking to his own children. "We want you to grow up in good conditions, to eat well, to study in a healthy and secure environment. But more than that, we want you to become strong. Because weak men bring times of war, and strong men build peace." The silence that followed was not empty, it was heavy, filled with the weight of responsibility. Every eye was fixed on him. For a moment, the dusty courtyard of Mariangouabi felt less like a camp and more like a battlefield of ideas where the future of the nation was being drawn. Then came the crescendo. Traoré's voice grew stronger, sharper as he declared, "La patrie ou la mort," the homeland or death. The children almost instinctively repeated after him. Again he shouted, and again their young voices thundered back in unison. 3 times the phrase echoed until it rose above the camp, carrying with it the weight of history. It was the same cry that had animated liberation movements across Africa, the same defiance that leaders like Thomas Sankara had once spoken. Now it was being revived in the mouths of a new generation. This was the climax, not a battle, not a military victory, but a ritual of unity between a leader and his people. It was symbolic yet profoundly real. Traoré had taken a group of ordinary teenagers and turned them, at least for that moment, into torchbearers of a national mission. The immediate reaction among the campers was unmistakable pride, excitement, a sense of belonging. Many of them would later describe this moment as the first time they felt the weight of being Burkinabe, not just by birth, but by duty. For them, chanting the homeland or death was not about dying for a flag, but about living for one another. But the reactions went beyond the camp. Parents who came to witness the ceremony spoke with tears in their eyes. For years, many families had lived under the shadow of war, unsure if their children would inherit anything but poverty and conflict. Yet here they saw a glimpse of something different, a government not merely asking for sacrifice but teaching resilience, solidarity, and discipline. Mothers wept quietly. Fathers stood taller, proud that their children were learning values they feared might be lost. Inside Burkina Faso, the symbolism of the camp ignited debate. Supporters praised Traoré for creating a program that went beyond speeches and politics, grounding his vision of a new nation in tangible action. They argued that this was the kind of leadership Africa needed, one that prepares its youth not just with textbooks, but with values, work ethic, and unity. Critics, however, raised concerns. Some feared that the civic military nature of the program blurred the line between education and indoctrination. Was Traoré training a new generation of responsible citizens or molding them into political loyalists? Internationally, the event stirred curiosity. African observers sympathetic to Burkina Faso's struggle praised it as a bold experiment in nation building. They compared it to programs once launched by liberation leaders in Mozambique, Tanzania, and Ghana, initiatives that had aimed to forge a collective spirit among the youth. Western voices, however, viewed it with suspicion. In the eyes of many foreign analysts, chants of the homeland or death echoed too strongly of revolutionary zeal, a rhetoric that reminded them of past leaders who had defied colonial or global powers. Some editorial pages described it as dangerously nationalist, while others dismissed it as a camp of indoctrination. Yet whether one saw it as inspiration or indoctrination, no one could deny its impact. For 10 days, a handful of teenagers had lived out a miniature version of the future Traoré envisioned, one marked by discipline, solidarity, humility, and national pride. And with his presence, his speech, and above all his rallying cry, the president transformed the camp into a stage where Burkina Faso's next chapter was rehearsed. The climax was not just in the chant, but in the realization a leader and his youth had locked eyes and shared a vow. For those who believed, it was proof that even in war, hope can be trained, practiced, and shouted until it echoes beyond borders. For those who doubted, it was a sign that Burkina Faso had entered a new phase one where education itself was becoming a battlefield. The echoes of La Patrie ou la Mort did not fade once the campers returned home. Instead, they rippled outward, carrying consequences that stretched beyond the dusty fields of Mariangouabi into classrooms, marketplaces, and political debates across Burkina Faso. The 10-day experiment had planted seeds that were already beginning to show their first shoots. On the civil side, the camp left behind more than paved courtyards and fruit trees. It left behind young citizens who began to see themselves differently. Teachers reported that students who had attended the camp came back more disciplined, more willing to help their peers, and more aware of the community around them. In villages, parents spoke of children, reminding their families about the values of sharing and solidarity, lessons they had embodied by eating together on the bare ground. In an environment scarred by conflict where trust between people had eroded, these small gestures were powerful. They suggested that a new generation might rebuild cohesion where older generations had been divided. The camp also reshaped the conversation about what education means in Burkina Faso. For decades, education had often been reduced to exams and diplomas, seen as a path to individual success. But Traoré's program reframed it. Education was not just about personal advancement, it was about preparing to serve the nation. The idea that civic duty, discipline, and humility could be just as important as mathematics or French literature sparked heated debate. Supporters argued it was the only way to build a self-reliant society, while critics worried it could slide into state control of thought. Yet even the critics admitted something had shifted. Politically, the camp carried even greater weight. By attending the closing ceremony himself, President Traoré signaled that this was not a side project, it was part of his larger vision for national reform. In doing so, he positioned himself not only as a wartime leader fighting external threats, but also as a teacher preparing the next generation. This dual role strengthened his image among many citizens who saw in him a leader willing to shape the long-term future, not just manage the present crisis. But this symbolism was not without risks. Opponents of Traoré warned that the civic-military format blurred the lines between patriotic education and political indoctrination. They asked, was this truly about preparing responsible citizens, or was it a way of instilling loyalty to one man and his government? The chants of the homeland or death, critics argued, sounded uncomfortably close to the revolutionary slogans of regimes that had once silenced dissent. In the polarized political climate of Burkina Faso, the camp became a litmus test: support it, and you were seen as aligned with Traoré's vision. Oppose it, and you risked being labeled unpatriotic. There were also broader consequences for civil society. Religious leaders praised the emphasis on discipline and solidarity, but some questioned whether mixing military drills with education might harden young people too early. Civil organizations that had long advocated for children's rights cautiously welcomed the program, but urged the government to ensure it remained voluntary, not compulsory. The debate reflected a deeper tension. How far should a nation in crisis go in reshaping its youth to prepare for an uncertain future? At the grassroots level, however, the effect was undeniable. Young people who had never felt noticed by the state suddenly found themselves at the center of a national project. Their pride was visible in the way they spoke, carried themselves, and shared stories of the camp with their peers. For many, it was the first time they felt not just like students or children, but like citizens with a role to play. That psychological shift, subtle yet profound, was perhaps the greatest consequence of all. In the end, the civil and political impact of the Mariangouabi camp could not be measured solely in paved squares or speeches. It was measured in changed perceptions, the way children viewed themselves, the way parents saw their families, and the way the nation debated its future. Whether embraced as a model or criticized as a warning, the camp had forced Burkina Faso to confront a simple truth. Its future would be decided not by foreign aid or external powers, but by the character of its own youth. From a distance, the images of Burkina Faso's youth camp seemed almost surreal to foreign observers. In a world where most summer camps are associated with games, music, and recreation, the sight of teenagers in dusty uniforms chanting the homeland or death struck a far deeper chord. The reactions abroad were as divided as they were revealing. In Africa, many leaders and commentators sympathetic to Burkina Faso saw the camp as a return to the continent's revolutionary roots. They drew parallels with Julius Nyerere's Ujamaa villages in Tanzania, or the civic training once practiced in Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah, moments when education was inseparable from the mission of nation building. To them, Traoré was reviving a tradition of shaping citizens who were not only educated in books, but also prepared to sacrifice for their communities. Across the Sahel, where instability and foreign interference had left scars, the program was celebrated as a symbol of self-reliance. Western observers, however, were far more skeptical. In Europe and the United States, some analysts framed the program as a camp of indoctrination, warning that mixing civic lessons with military discipline could create blind loyalty rather than critical thinking. For them, the chants of La Patrie ou la Mort carried echoes of revolutionary regimes that had once challenged Western-influence Cuba, Algeria, and even Sankara's Burkina Faso of the 1980s. American media in particular cast a wary eye, interpreting the initiative as yet another sign that Traoré's government was steering away from liberal democracy and toward a more authoritarian model of governance. Yet beyond suspicion, there was also a grudging respect. For decades, Western governments have preached about democracy and development in Africa, yet often delivered little beyond aid packages and structural adjustment programs. In contrast, Traoré's camp showed an African leader investing directly in the civic and moral fabric of his youth. Some U.S. commentators acknowledged this uncomfortable truth. While Washington spends billions on foreign wars and overseas bases, Burkina Faso is using limited resources to cultivate discipline, solidarity, and national pride among its children. For African diaspora communities in the U.S., particularly African Americans, the images carried a different resonance. Many saw in these camps a reflection of values long sought in their own neighborhoods: discipline, unity, and a sense of purpose larger than oneself. On social media, some African American voices praised Traoré, asking why similar programs to build civic responsibility and cultural pride did not exist in America's inner cities. Ultimately, the global reaction revealed more about the observers than the event itself. Supporters saw in Traoré's initiative a daring experiment in African self-determination. Critics saw the shadow of authoritarianism. But both agreed on one thing: Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré was not following the old script written for Africa by foreign powers. It was charting its own path and forcing the world, including the United States, to pay attention. As the dust settled over Mariangouabi, what remained was not simply the memory of a camp, but a mirror held up to the nation and to the world. For 10 days, Burkina Faso's youth had been taught lessons of discipline, humility, and solidarity. They had marched, planted trees, paved stones, and shouted words that once ignited revolutions: La Patrie ou la Mort. It was both a beginning and a warning. The warning lies in this: if this generation fails to carry forward the values they learned, the cycle of weakness and conflict will return. History is unforgiving to nations that forget discipline, unity, and self-reliance. A generation raised in comfort without responsibility risks becoming fragile, and fragile men, as Traoré reminded them, create times of war. That is not only a lesson for Burkina Faso, it is a lesson for every nation, including the United States, where comfort has too often dulled civic duty. The expansion lies in the possibility that this small camp could be the seed of something much larger. Traoré has already signaled his intention to bring this program into the national education system, ensuring that civic and patriotic training becomes a permanent feature of youth development. If successful, it may inspire other African nations to adopt similar models, reshaping how the continent raises its future leaders. Imagine a generation of Africans not waiting for aid or foreign direction, but building their countries with their own hands, values, and solidarity. That vision challenges not just Burkina Faso's enemies, but the global order itself. And then comes the question, one that echoes far beyond Ouagadougou. Do you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's youth training program is truly preparing the next generation, or does it risk turning into a system of control? This question matters not just for Burkinabe parents, but for Africans across the continent, and even for older Americans watching from afar. After all, what do we pass on to our children, comfort or character? If you are over 60 watching this from America, perhaps you remember when civic duty and discipline were once taught in schools, when being part of a community was valued above individual gain. Now you see a nation at war choosing to invest in its youth rather than surrender to despair. That is a story worth reflecting on. Please share this video if you believe you are among the first to recognize and support President Ibrahim Traoré's bold vision. And subscribe if you believe, like we do, that truth matters more than headlines. The children of Burkina Faso have already raised their voices. The question is, will the world listen?